everybody, and thanks for joining this virtual book talk and discussion with the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a political education and cultural center committed to building the unity of the working class here and abroad. TPF has a physical space in New York, but in times of COVID-19, TPF has really shifted temporarily to online programming, and we're just really happy that people all over the world can join us for this discussion. So my name is Ben Wilkins. I'm a labor organizer in North Carolina, and I'm a member of the steering committee of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Today, we're going to be discussing The Southern Key by Michael Goldfield. According to Professor Goldfield's book, the golden key to the last 75 years of American political development lies in the contest between labor and capital in the US South. The Southern Key charts the labor and radical movements of the 1930s and 40s in the US, focusing on four core industries: textiles, timber, coal mining, and steel. Professor Goldfield argues that the broad-based failure to organize the South during this period made it what it is today. The US South, according to Professor Goldfield, is today and has always been the key to understanding American society, politics, and culture. And before we get started, I just want to quickly introduce our speakers. So Professor Michael Goldfield is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and currently Research Fellow at the Fraser Center for Workplace Issues at Wayne State University. A former labor union and civil rights activist, Goldfield's work focuses on the study of labor, class, race, and American politics. And I'm also really happy that we are joined by Rosalind Pellis. Roz has been a labor and freedom movement activist since the 1960s. She's currently the strategic senior advisor to the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. With over 50 years of movement experience, her work is focused right now on the growing poor people's movements across the country. She's previously served as the executive director of the National Rainbow Coalition, director of the Civil, Human, and Women's Rights Department of the AFL-CIO, executive director of the North Carolina NAACP, and is a senior strategist and advisor to the North Carolina Moral Monday Forward Together movement. And Roz is currently working on a book with Jordan T. Camp, a collaborative autobiography called As Goes the South, The Life and Lessons of Roz Pellis. Many of us movement leaders in the South really consider Roz a mentor and a really important leader for the work that we do. So I'm just very excited that we're joined by two really, I think, deep thinkers and important movement leaders who really believe and clearly understand the role of the South. So I wanted to just get started, Mike, by really starting to ask you to kind of give us an overview of the kind of arguments in the book. I want to begin with a quote from the introduction. You say that the political transformation of the US South holds the central lever for transforming the United States as a whole. The key to transforming the South today, as in the past, lies in the ability of its workers to organize themselves collectively, especially across racial, ethnic, and gender lines. And your book specifically really focuses on the 30s and 40s. So could you just give us an overview of the main arguments that you present and tell us why you decided to focus on this period?
30s and the 1940s was the last major upsurge of labor organizing that threatened or had the possibility of transforming the country as a whole. And the South, partly because of or mostly because of the existence of slavery and later sharecropping and the oppression of African Americans in the South, has always been the most backward region in the country. And even today, it's the case, it's the place where people disproportionately support Donald Trump, where people are disproportionately birthers. In other words, they didn't believe that Barack Obama was born in this country, despite evidence to the contrary, and a number of other things. And the 1930s and 1940s, I argue, had the potential to transform the South. But with defeat of interracial unions in the most important industry, the South remained a backwater, and it affected the civil rights movement. The labor and civil rights activities of the 1930s and 1940s um, only survived in small places, and the civil rights movement itself did not have union and labor support, particularly among whites, when it took place in the 1960s. This also allowed white backlash to develop across the South. Individual whites were easily repressed, deprived of their livelihood, some of them murdered. And so the civil rights movement had very little white support in the South. This led in some ways to the racist campaigns of George Wallace in 64, 68, and the turn of the Republican Party to try to win whites on the basis of racial hatred away from the Democrats to the Republican Party. So we had Nixon's Southern strategy. Reagan, who people seem to talk kindly of, ran extremely racist campaigns. He talked about welfare queens getting all the money from welfare, crime in the street. He began his 1984 re-election campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was the site of the 1964 brutal murders of the civil rights martyrs, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodwin. It continues through George Bush, who's also getting friendly waves from the media these days, who ran the very racist Willie Horton ads, drawing a straight line from that period up to the racist, misogynist, anti-immigrant, egocentric Donald Trump, who's no anomaly in the post-war period, but a continuation of these trends. And I argue that if labor had been successful and interracial unions had been more successful, the South might have been transformed. So the book looks at 4 industries in the South, 2 that were successful, coal mining and steel, and the 2 biggest that were not successful, textile and the woodworking industry, and wood includes sawmills and also lumberjacks who cut down wood. And what I also argue is that the possibilities which some people think didn't exist are suggested in the state of Alabama. So Alabama seems unlikely as a deep state, the place where George Wallace came from.
Mike, I think we lost you. I can't hear you. I still can't hear you. Still can't hear you, Mike. See if the mute button, is the mute button on, Mike? We've been talking for about 4 hours and you haven't muted yourself a single time, and now you decided to do it when we're live. Maybe try unplugging your headphones and just speaking through the. There you go. We can hear you.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
I don't know what happened with the headphones. Where were we when you lost me?
We had just started talking about the 4 core industries, and you had started talking about Alabama exceptionalism.
Okay, so here's the thing about Alabama. So Alabama elected a fairly liberal, anti-segregationist, pro-labor governor. In 1946, he was re-elected again in 1954. Big Jim Folsom He argued that African Americans should get the franchise. He had interracial rallies, shook hands with African Americans as well as whites. And he argued that racism was a tool by the rich to divide poor people. So I'm not arguing he was a militant civil rights activist. It was very different from the political leaders in the Deep South and other states in the Deep South. Also, Alabama at this time had the most progressive worker safety laws, including coal mine safety in the country. So how did this happen? It turns out that Alabama was the most unionized state in the South. It had 26% unionization. And to put that in perspective, there's no state today that has as high a rate of union membership as Alabama had during that time. Alabama had workers across the whole state in a variety of industry: coal, steel, longshore. And the coal miners in particular were the vanguard of the labor movement. And the counties where they were strong, they organized everybody else. They organized textile workers, who were generally difficult to organize. They organized woodworkers. They organized school teachers. They organized cleaning women who cleaned people's houses. And in a couple counties, they even organized school principals. So this is what people today call wall-to-wall organizing. And so this happened in Alabama, and the labor movement was strong enough to help elect Folsom, but it also had kept the powers that be from repressing the labor movement to the degree that it did in the South, because they would have to face the wrath of this large number of workers. So the possibilities for organizing the South existed. And what the book tries to do is looks at the successes and failures and why some of these failures actually took place. So that's the overview in terms of the book. The four industries I look at, two were successful, two were not. There were 3 or 4 other industries that were organized in the South, across the South, including longshore, metal mining, and the oil industry, which was primarily located in Texas and Oklahoma, as it is today. So some industries have changed, and some, they've all changed, but some have decreased in importance, like coal. But the oil industry remains a bedrock in certain states in the country. How long? Let's see. So I want to just mention one other thing about how important coal miners were to the upsurge. So in most of the literature, you read that it was progressive labor legislation that helped workers organize. And I argue in my chapter on coal miners that that's actually not true. Although everybody claimed that was the case, when you look at the archival data, coal miners were actually organized before the first piece of pro-labor legislation was passed. And once the 600,000 coal miners across the country organized, they provided help and aid and inspiration to every other group of workers in the country. They helped organize steel workers, woodworkers. They even helped the auto workers, who are mostly located in the north, including mostly in Michigan, the state where I am now, and which continues to have the state with the highest percentage of auto workers and auto part workers. Although, interestingly today, one difference is that large numbers of auto plants and auto parts have moved to the South in the past couple decades. Why don't I stop there? Because I think some of the other things I want to say are things that you probably have questions about, and I can use that opportunity to.
No, sure, thanks. I think that's a really great kind of introduction to the core arguments. So Roz, I wanted to kind of get your take on some of this stuff. You know, you've been a leader in dozens of really important struggles going back to the 60s. So, In your view, why is movement building and labor organizing in the South so important? And what are some of your reactions to some of what Professor Goldfield just laid out?
So I'm real glad to be here with you, Ben, and with Michael Goldfield to discuss your new book, Michael, Southern Key. As a Southerner and an organizer in the South for many years, I first want to give some reactions and reflections on the book, and then move from there into the question. Ben, if that's okay. I find this book incredibly important to fundamentally understanding the South, its history, the role of labor and labor organizing and its development, and its politics. The book also examines labor's institutions, the unions, the AFL, the CIO, and their relationships to each other and to social movements at the time. So Southern Key is focused in the 1930s and 40s, and it also examines the questions around labor, race, and class during this period. Raised in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, as a young organizer, I was mentored by labor leaders from this period that's discussed here, particularly Velma Hopkins, a leader as a young woman in the 1943 R.J. Reynolds strike that was led by the CIO. So I was particularly interested in understanding the examination of politics, strategy, and leadership provided by the CIO to worker struggles in those times. And so Goldfield's book puts that struggle and others of the time into a context that really explains the victories and defeats of that time. But I don't want us to be confused, because Southern Key, however, is not just a history lesson. It gives us insight and helps to explain to a degree why it's often said, as the South goes, so goes the nation. It gives insight into why organizing the South is important. The South then and now continues to shape and define America's character and direction. And you heard Professor Goldfield talk about that and describe that whole, why that's true. The South is at the crossroads of the nation's economy and politics. So this is why organizing the South remains as critical today as in the 30s and the 40s. As Goldfield points out, organizing the South was challenging in the early years, and unions and political parties were reluctant, in many cases, to put the resources and energy into the organizing. It's ironic, but now they're still reluctant to organize. And this is happening at our own peril. The road to a more equitable future nationally really runs through the South, and we should talk more about that. So I find this, I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion, because this book really raises many questions that have, that would serve to benefit organizers today. It also challenges us to think about some of the things we have long held as truths. The role of certain labor leaders, about organizing structures and styles, and also challenges us to look at some of the institutions like the CIO. So I think that these points will make for a real good discussion as we continue.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. And I think I have a few kind of pointed questions about the book and the historical argument, and then I would just love to talk with both of y'all kind of on the tail end of this conversation about the lessons for today. I think there's a real value in that. But Mike, in the book, you kind of make this distinction and really delve deeply into the relationship between what you call structural power and associational power. So you focus on the importance of the structural power of the coal miners, for example, in the southern states, who were able to wield tremendous power really through their position in the economy, and then the associative power of the unemployed councils and other social movements of the 1930s. And I just love the way that you talk about the relationship between those two forms of power and how the working class is able to wield those two forms of power and really how they were used to build the movement in the 30s. So could you just talk about a little more about what those two forms are, how they were used, and what they really mean for you in this book?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things that I argue is that in organizing industries, you have to decide how much leverage, what I call structural power, workers have. Coal miners had a great deal of structural power. They went down deep under the earth. They built structures to keep from caving in, and they used dynamite to loosen the coal. Nobody in their right mind would go down in a coal mine if they didn't know what they were doing and start using dynamite down there. So when coal miners struck, and when they struck often through whole states or across the whole country, you could not find miners who would go down to mine the coal. The second thing about coal mines, and this is in contrast to the textile industry, is that coal exists where it is underground. So there's no question that you can go someplace else, go to a country that doesn't have coal and mine it. The rich seams were in the United States. We produced a significant percentage of the world's coal during that time. Coal was also the main fuel for the country, for railroads, for boats, for home ships, home heating, energy. And so it was critical. And if coal miners stopped work, they had a big effect on the economy. And so that's one reason coal miners, when they finally rose up, were able to have a lot of leverage. Other groups of workers have leverage too, but sometimes they don't use it. So in the 19th century, railroad workers had a lot of leverage. They stopped work and had national strikes, and the goods in the country didn't move. Truckers have that sort of power, but have never used it. In contrast, we have textile workers who, it's a low skill, low capital industry. Textile, you can train people to get up to speed in a few weeks in most textile factories. Textile, if they don't like what's going, textile owners, if they don't like what's going on, they can move. So virtually all textile, except very expensive specialty textile, has moved out of the United States. For a while, and we can see after World War II, it was in Japan, it was in South Korea and Taiwan, then it went to cheaper places in China, and when wages rose in China, they moved out of China, and China is no longer the main producer of textiles. It's in even countries where wages are even poorer. So if textile workers are to organize, they need a lot of allies. And this is something that labor leaders in the CIO did not understand. So in Alabama, which I talked about before, textile workers organized. They had allies or associative power, starting with coal miners and others in the labor movement. And they also had a whole series of other movements, social movements, which we'll talk about. So an interesting thing is in Gadsden, Alabama, which was an industrial town with a big rubber plant with coal miners nearby, steel, a textile plant was organized. When laundry workers went on strike, laundry workers don't have a lot of leverage, structural power. The company fired all several hundred of the laundry workers. Thousands of workers came out of their plants and picketed the laundry, and no scabs or replacement workers got there, and the laundry workers were reinstated and won their demands. So having those allies within the labor movement helps. The other thing is the 1930s and 1940s are distinguished by having these very broad-based militant social movements, the unemployed movement being the biggest and the most important. And the unemployed workers who were organized mostly by left-wing groups supported many key strikes, including the famous ones in 1934, the Trotskyist-led truckers strike in Minneapolis, the Longshore strikes in San Francisco, and their biggest impact was in the Toledo Auto Light plant in Toledo,
where tens of thousands of unemployed workers manned the picket line, fought off the guard, and wouldn't let replacement workers into the plant. So having these type of allies is critical. And the go-it-alone approach that's used generally by people in today's unions doesn't cut it. And we can give two examples where people actually did mobilize outside support and were successful that people may be familiar with. One is Justice for Janitors, starting in Southern California. Janitors don't have a lot of leverage. You fire the janitors, you get somebody else to clean. But they mobilized large numbers of people from the community to shut down big office buildings when the people who owned the companies said, oh, they weren't responsible for the people who cleaned the building, they subcontracted it out. But as soon as the janitors with broad community support shut down the office buildings, the people in the big companies in the buildings suddenly found ways to recognize, to get their subcontractors to recognize the unions and raise their pay. Another one, which is probably less well known, is in Mississippi, in the Deep South, which became a center for catfish farming. So catfish used to be something of a junk food, garbage food. People mostly wouldn't, unless they were very poor, wouldn't eat catfish, and eventually became a delicacy grown in these big farms, some of which had over 1,000 workers there. So in the South, the catfish catfish workers, overwhelmingly African-American, helped mobilize their communities in the 80s in sort of a rebirth of the labor civil rights movement, and successfully organized across Mississippi. So they used their own leverage, structural power, but also the associative power from the community, and they even forced all the local politicians to support them as well. And so the companies were fairly overwhelmed and recognized the union. So while these movements were, of course, much bigger and more important, and that includes farmers and sharecroppers and students, a broad civil rights movement, those movements still exist and can exist today, and may flare up even to the degree that they did during the 1930s.
And could you, no, I think it's such an important, go ahead, Ross.
So Ben, I just wanted to comment on this, this way Mike is laying out power, this whole question of structural power and associative power, because it's really a critical thing, a critical distinction when you're organizing. It was critical then, it's critical now. And it's as Mike points out in the book, it's not widely understood or appreciated. And so often that's why struggles fail. And that's why they fail then and they fail now because of that. So, and so we really have to, I mean, especially the unions have to get a hold of that and understand that that's the way we win. That in fact, most of the people we're organizing today left on their own have associative power. You know, the people I organized in the hospitals, when I was in textiles, when I know other places, they have associative power. They need, in order to win, they need the support of the community and of their, you know, they need not to separate the workers from their natural lines of being. And so our unions need to learn that now and learn from those lessons that Mike points out in the book. And so I think that the point is for now is if we don't grasp that, we don't win. And I think that's one of the main things that I really loved about this book, was really pulling out this this power, understanding this power dynamic as you're trying to organize.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Roz. I think you could have been my co-author in this book.
Well, maybe after Roz is done with her book, y'all can write a book together. I think a lot of people would read that. And I just to kind of deepen this point, you know, there's a massive crisis of unemployment happening right now, of course. And I just really appreciated your treatment of the unemployed councils Mike, and their really, I think, central role in catalyzing the labor movement in the 30s. And I think when we were talking the other day, you noted that, the strike wave in 1919 was actually of a larger scale than anything that really happened in the 30s, but it was really the social movements and specifically the unemployed councils that were critical. Could you just for like a couple minutes, maybe just talk about the role that those councils played specifically and the kind of work they did?
Yeah, so the unemployed councils did a number of things. First of all, they were active in the communities. They fought evictions. So in major cities in the country, large numbers of people were evicted, and the unemployed council would break the locks on the doors, move people's furniture back in. When the police came, they would fight the police, and this happened not only in Detroit and Chicago and New York. It happened in Birmingham, Alabama, and in every city throughout virtually every city throughout the South. So this was a massive movement of the unemployed around the country, and farmers were active too. I mean, one of the interesting things is that farmers became very militant. They were selling things below the cost of production. Many of them were going bankrupt. So banks would come in to sell off their equipment and their farms. Farmers would all show up with guns. These were called penny sales. And so somebody from the farmers organization would bid a penny for the property with the understanding that someone else who tried to buy the property might not make it away. And so in that way, they prevented evictions and seizures by banks of the farm equipment and property. And at times, the farmers movement supported strikes and supported workers' struggles. They brought food to the truckers' strike in Minneapolis. They did the same thing at a number of other strikes when people were out on strike. So the combination of these social movements went a very long way to giving strength and solidarity to the movement.
Yeah, no, thank you. I thought it's important to just key in on that specific piece. So Mike, you mentioned earlier that left-wing groups were heavily involved in the social movements and in the CIO as well, and you specifically really spend an entire chapter talking about the role of the Communist Party. So the Communist Party played a major role in the CIO and the unemployed councils and really all the movement of the 30s. And I think you have a really interesting assessment in the book. So two questions. One, what was their strategy for organizing in the South? And why were they unable to pose an alternative to what you call the center leadership of the CIO?
So the communists were responsible for a large amount of the organizing, and especially in the South. They played a major role in terms of organizing steel workers around the country. Steel was important in the South. In fact, the CIO couldn't have organized the steel industry, and they made an alliance with the Communist Party, and a large percentage of the organizers and almost all the African-American organizers were connected to the Communist Party. And the Communist Party plays a contradictory role in the period that I look at. The positive and most heroic thing is that both their black and white and even immigrant worker cadre were among the staunchest fighters for civil rights for African Americans in the South, in the North, for Mexican Americans in the Southwest, of any type of group. So they led. So they were not only active in terms of the Black community in the unemployed movement, but they had a number of defense cases that galvanized people around the country and around the world. The most important one was the Scottsboro case. 9 Black youth who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a freight train that they were all traveling on. And this was a big defense case that they mobilized people around the whole country for. And they saved the Scottsboro boys from being executed, and eventually they were pardoned and released after a period of time, whereas normally they would have probably all been executed. So the communists led defense cases. They insisted in the South, wherever they were, that interracial organizing, that African Americans had the same rights and access that whites had. And they were successful in many unions in terms of doing this. In a later period, particularly the Popular Front period, that became very conciliatory toward the mainstream leaders of the CIO and also to the Democratic Party. They played a tailist role. They supplied, and contrary to the general story about communists that they secretly try to take over unions, they actually gave up control of unions where they were the most popular leaders. So in the auto industry, which they had played a major role in organizing, where their main communist leaders were sort of the heroes of the auto workers, they could have easily been elected to the top offices. And the National Communist Party didn't allow these top leaders to run for offices in the union because they didn't want to make the more conservative, liberal, these people just call themselves right wing, but they were liberal leaders of the CIO, nervous about the communists taking over the union. And they did this in a number of unions. They became very uncritical of the Roosevelt administration during the late 30s. So when Franklin D. Roosevelt, president during the Depression, refused to support anti-lynching legislation, they apologized for him. When the Western capitalist countries refused to give aid to the loyalists in Spain who were fighting a fascist takeover of a democratically elected government under the leadership of General Franco, and the Nazis and fascists were giving aid to Franco, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and the Roosevelt administration, the Democratic Party, which controlled Congress and the presidency, refused to give any aid to the loyalists. The communists apologized and said that it wasn't really Roosevelt's fault. It was, I don't know, somebody else's fault. So they played a very conciliatory role, which I argue helped undermine much of the good work in the unions that they did. So they glorified Philip Murray, and I have a long chapter on the steelworkers on how they started out in their organizing as very militant, interracial, pro-civil rights, and became a very backward, undemocratic, authoritarian, racially obtuse, I think is a kind word to call them, union, and lost any progressive tinge that they might have initially had. And the communists, because they thought their alliance with these people was most important, basically apologized for the leadership of the union. So they played a role in the organizing that was very critical. They pushed civil rights issues, and they later undermined much of the good work that they had done.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's, I think, a really important treatment. Roz, did you have any?
So it is really an important treatment, and really it challenges.
Roz, now you're mute.
Yeah, I lost you.
Am I good now?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. So it, this characterization of the Communist Party at that point, looking at both their high points when they were really operating from the values that communists have and left-wing organizers had at that point, and Michael laid them all out, around civil rights and human rights, and then at some point capitulating and not carrying through. I mean, that's a really good treatment of it, and it kind of goes against what sometimes what we've learned or what we've thought is that that communists just traditionally were always pushing the, building and pushing the unions in the right way. So it really does challenge some of the thinking that we might have, and you've shown that we should look more carefully at history and in this particular instant. But I wondered, I mean, it's like what I was hearing and what I did read is about the important work and the great leaps forward that came, when the communists were really supporting the union movement and were involved and really, and it really had a great consequence on the ability of the unions to grow. And so what I'm thinking and wondering is if we're seeing a diminishing labor movement now, and we're also seeing not strong left and Communist Party involvement in these struggles directly. And I wonder if you had any thinking about that at all. I mean, in terms of that or left mass organizations and any idea about how that would change unionization and today. And I know your book is 30s and 40s, but I also have a sense that you really understand what the broader than that.
Mike, you're muted if you're trying to talk. You still on mute, Mike. I'm gonna give you like 10 seconds and
Ben, be kind to us.
it's all actually, I think we're gonna, it might be a little bit of a blessing that Mike is on mute because
I'm good. So you can contrast some of the things that took place in the South with what we've seen recently. So the auto workers, who are a heritage of the right wing of the CIO, go into a place, and I was a UAW member in an international harvester plant in Chicago for 9 years, so I have some intimate experience with this. They go into a place, they don't try to mobilize any allies, they hand out cards to people and hope that they'll vote for the union. And when there's big opposition, as there has been in numerous places, they fail. So they failed in Chattanooga. Politicians came in and threatened that they wouldn't help the company, Volkswagen. And they even lost a little over a year ago in Canton, Mississippi, at a Nissan plant, where they basically didn't convince workers that they had much to offer them. And that's in contrast to what we saw. So another case in Mississippi in 1946, Laurel, Mississippi was considered the plywood capital of the world in 1946. Southern pine is unlike hardwoods, which you cut it down and it takes hundreds of years maybe to grow back. Southern pine grows very quickly, so it's a renewable agricultural good. And so the industrial unions had organized the town, and the last plant in the town was a textile mill and a plywood factory, both of them overwhelmingly white in racist Mississippi. So the powers that be, outspoken white supremacists, Senator Theodore Bilbo and Senator John and Congressman John Rankin, came forward attacking the unions, saying that they were integrationists, that they were this and that, and that they wouldn't stand for unions to be, for this union organized to be successful in Mississippi. The white workers paid no attention to them and overwhelmingly voted for unionization. Why was that? Because the unions had allies in the community, other workers who mobilized on their behalf, and they went out and they gained support from the whole community, including small business owners who felt that the higher wages that unionized workers got gave them more business. And we see very little of this type of organizing going on today. So that's certainly a lesson to be learned. And if the revitalization of a labor movement is to take place, it has to be done on a different basis than most unions are willing to do today.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. So I want to shift gears a little bit. At a number of different points in the book, you argue against what you call the cultural explanation for why so few Southern workers are organized. And so I can think, to my experience of, beginning organizing in North Carolina and being told by a number of people that, we were never going to be successful because Southern workers are too afraid to join a union, or they don't know how to join together, they're too backwards, whatever. I can just speak from personal experiences. I know you and Roz both can, that is not true. So could you just explain kind of what you mean by the cultural explanation and why you don't agree with that line of thinking?
Sure. So the standard thing, both historically and also particularly about textile workers in the South on why they didn't organize, is that they're submissive, there's Southern paternalism, they're not willing to stick up for themselves, or alternatively, that they're too individualistic, that they're not willing to engage and they're hot-headed and not willing to engage in collective action. But if you look at the history of Southern workers, including textile workers, they're as militant and willing to organize unions as anyone else. And I think the advantage of contrasting or looking at several industries is that coal miners were in the same cultural milieu as textile workers. They had a great deal of repression against them. They had the same background. Many of them originally came from agricultural or sharecropping backgrounds, as did the textile workers, but they managed to organize. They had leverage, they had structural power, which the textile workers didn't. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies of textile workers that say the reason they weren't successful is because of this culture of submissiveness, Southern paternalism, when in reality, textile workers the world over suffer from some of these same problems, almost everywhere in the world. And I did a separate study, only a little bit of which is in the book, of textile workers in 8 other major textile producing countries in the world. And they're all militant, ready to form union, and except in exceptional circumstances when they have important allies, they're almost always defeated, the same way Southern textile workers were in the United States. So this cultural argument belies the fact that workers as human beings have certain needs, and when they see collective possibilities to achieve those needs, particularly in terms of forming a union, they'll do it. And I think we'll probably see the same thing today as warehouse workers and some of the big logistic hubs, and logistics hubs is the name for warehouses and transportation centers where all these e-commerce goods are shipped from. Some of the big hubs are in big cities in the South. Memphis and Louisville both have big hubs. And workers today are faced not only with terrible working conditions, we've been hearing about this for years, particularly what Amazon workers have been facing in terms of speed up and everything, but the addition of the COVID-19 coronavirus puts these workers in very unsafe positions, and we see workers speaking up more and looking like they're more ready to make the sacrifices needed to organize than they were 6 months ago or 6 years ago. So, and what the powers that be fail to recognize that these are human beings with needs. And I was struck by looking at the interview, I think it was in South Dakota, where one of the judges said when there was a challenge on the stay-at-home orders, said, yes, but the spread of the disease only affected the meatpacking workers, not the real folks outside the plant. Anybody else saw that same interview?
Yeah.
And this is sort of shocking types of things, not recognizing the humanity of people doing these important jobs, which in this period of time, the rest of us are completely dependent upon. So the assertion of humanity is something fairly universal. And one thing the miners' leader, John L. Lewis, said that if given the chance, he couldn't imagine that there wasn't any worker in the country who wouldn't want a union to protect them.
So I really was struck by this this argument about this cultural explanation, and really agree that basically that's not the answer. That's not the answer when workers aren't organized. It's almost an excuse. And so I come out of working in textile mills in North Carolina, and so my experience was that workers can be organized and can be militant across all lines if there's a reason to believe that they can actually win and make some gains, if people are telling the truth, and if they see people actually being in a position to bring some people together. So my experience really dovetails nicely with this book, and I think it's been used as an excuse almost not to do the kind of hard organizing, taking the risk that have to be taken in those instances. Because one of the things that people often say about organizing in the South is that there's a race problem. And there is a race issue. I mean, really, you know, but it's not insurmountable. It becomes a problem when people don't want to talk about it. You have to be willing in the South, when organizing, to talk about race, because it's there. And so it actually, if it's not talked about, you can't get around it. And so I think as organizers in the South, we can't talk about a cultural problem. We have to look at our problems, kind of our fears, our inability to put resources in, our inability to go in there for the long haul, not to sign up for 6 weeks, not to go in and come out, but to go in for the long haul, because that's what the South requires, as your book teaches us for today's work. And so I think we really have to pull out this piece of your book and start to use it as we're organizing today, especially as we're organizing the South, and especially as more unions are starting to weigh in the South in some important ways. Some of the unions were doing that before this crisis. And so I love this this exposition in the book, and I hope people really take it to heart, unravel it, and try to use it.
Yeah.
No,
Go ahead, Mike.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. And so the point that Roz raises is critical. So white workers have further to go because they have to, because not all of them, but many of them have racist attitudes and prejudices to overcome. And we see the mine workers, for example, in Alabama and in West Virginia. And Alabama certainly was more racist and vicious in the 1930s than anything we confront today. And workers successfully got together, decided they needed each other. The union made, at that time when the Ku Klux Klan was very strong, Ku Klux Klan membership incompatible with being a union member. If you joined the Klan, you were expelled from the union, or if you were found to be a member of the Klan. The other thing in Alabama that the coal miners did is they took groups of Black and white workers to register to vote and to pay poll taxes that had to be paid. So they engaged in voter registration in Alabama on an interracial basis. And these activities, as Roz says, confronting racial discrimination and racial oppression directly, won white workers to supporting civil rights types of agendas. And we can say that, see the same thing in isolated instances. So one interesting case is in Louisville, Kentucky, where the farm equipment workers, which was a left-wing communist-led union, they had 4,000 or 5,000 workers in this plant, depending on the year, 14% African-American, but the local itself was very civil rights oriented, involved hundreds of whites in sit-ins at parks and beaches, around swimming pools, libraries, hotels in the Louisville area, as well as desegregating all the segregation that existed in the plant, separate eating areas, separate showers, separate locker rooms. So they fought those issues, and most of the whites and the locals were convinced to support it, that it was part of having a stronger union. And I think that's the task that has to be faced. And today, so in the 30s and 40s in the South, we're talking about basically just blacks and whites. But now we have lots of immigrants, we have lots of Latinos in the South. So the type of coalition and broad-based multiracial, we also have issues of female workers that were not confronted very well, and even at times by more left-wing organizers and unions, were not confronted as well during the 30s and 40s, and that's a lesson to be learned today. So workers groups, parties, unions become stronger when these issues of special oppression and special discrimination get confronted in the movements. So, and I think that's a lesson to be learned. I don't know if you want to get into Operation Dixie yet at this point, but the refusal to face those issues weakened the labor movement in the South and led to many of the failures that took place.
Yeah, I do want to get into Operation Dixie, and I think piggybacking off of the idea that Roz talked about of, you can unite people across lines of race if you confront race and go through race rather than trying to go around it or trying to deny it. And I just think that's such an important organizing principle in the US as a whole, but especially in the South. And, I really appreciated your treatment of Operation Dixie. For folks who don't know, Operation Dixie was the effort of the CIO to organize the South in the mid-1940s, shortly after World War II. I had always kind of seen it, and I think a lot of people have always kind of seen it as this kind of heroic missed moment where, the labor movement really tried to organize the South and tried to kind of solve this problem of the unorganized South. You have really kind of undergone a big change in your thinking on the subject that I think is really fascinating. And I would just love to hear your kind of how your assessment has changed and how you kind of view Operation Dixie now.
So, right. So I originally bought the standard line that Operation Dixie was this major attempt to organize the South, and that it failed because it met overwhelming hostility from owners in the South. But I think stepping back a little, one thread in the country as a whole, but particularly in the South, was that liberal union leaders thought that they could get somewhere by making friends with the employers and collaborating with them. So that's the approach of my old union, the auto workers. They want to collaborate and help the companies, and that often goes against fighting against the companies for the rights of the workers. So Operation Dixie had this approach, and as I started reading all the archival material on Operation Dixie and what unions did, it turned out, first of all, that they didn't put nearly as much money as had been put in the 30s in two single industry campaigns, in steel in 1936 to 37 and in textile 37 to 38. So those campaigns had 3 and 4 times as much money and way more organizers than the CIO put into organizing the whole South. Also in steel, where the mine workers who were behind the organizing of steel realized they didn't have any contacts in the steel industry, they hired dozens, 60 to 80 of their initial organizers were communists who were rooted in the steel towns and had histories of organizing. And they had communists from immigrant groups. A lot of the steel workers were first or second generation ethnic immigrants. Operation Dixie, in contrast, in a industry that was at least 40% women, and in some places the textile mills were majority female, they hired almost exclusively male organizers. And rather than hiring people who were experienced, they wanted to look good so they wouldn't be baited. And so they hired mostly inexperienced white male veterans with no experience in organizing. And of course, these people were, as I read the organizer report, were mostly clueless on what they were doing. So, and they also, unlike in steel, excluded people, not only people who were themselves left-wingers, but who had had any contact with left-wing unions. So they went about it all wrong. And in some ways, I decided that Operation Dixie was a primer on how not to organize. They wouldn't take help from any allies, even liberal allies in the South. They wouldn't take help from church groups. They didn't even want to have help from the CIO's own political action committee, whose goal was to overthrow the white supremacist Dixiecrat politicians in southern states. So Operation Dixie people often try to make nice with these politicians, including Strom Thurmond in South Carolina, which was a major so South Carolina and North Carolina, where Roz is from, were the two biggest textile states during that time. So as I read through this material, it seemed to me that this was just a primer on how not to organize. And plus the racial obtuseness and what I would call racism, which isn't captured when people do interviews with these former liberal organizers. By the 70s or 80s, anybody who's a liberal says that they were pro-civil rights in the 40s. But when you read what they said then in their reports, it's pretty jaw-dropping. So it seems to me that Operation Dixie is a case study on how not to organize. And I've had a couple people who were, including Canadians who were in unions, look at that chapter and say, this sounds like my union, unfortunately. So that's where we're at today. And if we want to look for the revitalization of the labor movement, and particularly how to organize in the South, both the positive and negative cases give us some perspective on what to do and what not to do.
Well, all I can say is that reading that chapter in the book really challenged my historic thinking and my understanding of Operation Dixie, and made me want to dig into that a little deeper, because it really does challenge kind of what I've been taught over time.
No, me too. I mean, I actually had the misfortune of writing several articles that Operation Dixie was the big turning point for the labor movement after World War II. And when I did the research for this book, I decided that it was really sort of a coda, the final chapter on the things that had been done wrong before that. That it was not so much a turning point as an exclamation point.
Yeah, I read those articles, Mike. So thanks for giving me the wrong analysis and then changing my mind and giving me the right analysis. I appreciate it. It's really, really great work that you did in the book. So the next thing I want to talk about is kind of transitioning us to talk about today. So how did the failure to organize Southern workers in the 30s and 40s shape US politics in the rest of the 20th and 21st century?
So, so the possibilities for, I argue in the book, for transforming the South, as we got a glimmer of in Alabama, existed during the 1930s and 1940s. But the South has always been a politically backward, and W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction says, in answering the question of why there's no socialism, by which he meant why there's no Labor Party, Socialist Party, Communist Party that has major strength in the country, the real answer to that question is why there's no liberalism in the South. So the South, as a result of slavery and sharecropping, remained a place where the value of human life, even among whites, was low. It's the place where 80 to 90% of death penalties are carried out to this day. The 3 southern states, Texas, Virginia, although Virginia may be moving away from that, Virginia and Oklahoma have the majority of death penalty executions of the 50 states in the country as a whole. The South has the lowest percentage, the highest percentage of people without health care. So if we look at all the things that go to supporting human life and decency, the South in certain ways fails by a number of criteria. As I said, in terms of the racism of the South, there are parts of the country where hardly any whites believe in the birther myth, that Obama was not born in the United States. And you can look it up, you can see the birth certificate on the web. Why would you believe that he was born someplace in Africa? You have to be racist or open to racist things. And there are states in the South where a majority of whites believe that. So the failure of the labor movement, and the South remains the place where workers are least organized. North Carolina and South Carolina have the lowest rate of unionization of any states in the country, several percent. And you may know the exact figures for North Carolina now, but 3 or 4% in North Carolina and South Carolina. And we can also see the change that took place in West Virginia, a state that was at one point over 50% unionized because it was such a dominant coal state. And the coal miners helped organize everybody else. And it was in some ways a very liberal state, to now when there's hardly any coal miners left and hardly any unions, despite the fact that West Virginia has the largest percentage of people who get disability aid from the federal government, the largest number of people who have health care problems. There are less than 10,000 coal miners left in West Virginia. There are 135, 140, and actually I don't know what it is today because in the past 3 months, everything's fallen apart, but there are well over 100,000 healthcare workers taking care of all these sick people in West Virginia. Yet, because of the lack of any collective organization, the appeal is to coal, and people buy that and they vote for Donald Trump. And in contrast, there are states in the North where hardly any whites are birthers. And even in Michigan, supposedly a swing state, I think it's less than 10% of whites, and in New York and California, it's considerably less. So this is a part of the country whose transformation is key to transforming the country as a whole. And when I mentioned about the auto plants and the parts places, so auto was an industry where 20, 30 years ago, virtually all auto production in the country was done by American companies. That automobiles that were manufactured by foreign companies were imported into the United States, as Toyota really did when it made a benchmark, when it made a breach into the market. Today, 25% of auto production in the country as a whole is done by transplants, meaning that, and that's mostly Japanese, meaning that Toyota, Nissan, Mitsubishi have plants in the United States. And they've primarily, although not exclusively, located those in the South, particularly parts. So Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama are big centers for parts production, particularly. So the industrialization of parts of the South gives workers who in general are open to unionization around the world. Auto workers tend to organize, and they have leverage. If auto workers stop producing things, the cars can't go off the assembly line. If their parts are critical, like engines or brakes, that ends things for the whole supply chain. So there's been a lot of movement of industry to the South, and I mentioned the logistic hubs. So the possibilities for organizing in the South have actually increased. Longshore is still important in the South. We have big ports all along the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf Coast. As international trade has become more important, these ports ship more and more goods. So, and the organization of the South and the transforming of Southern politics, which is partly taking place also because of the changing racial and ethnic composition of the South, and the higher percentages of non-white workers than we used to see, creates possibilities for organizing that didn't exist previously. So this is an opportune time for people like yourself and others to make beachheads and finally breach the anti-union backward parts of the South. I just want to say one other thing. So it's interesting, the South is contradictory in certain ways. So the South has contributed lots of important struggles to the nation's history, but in other ways, so the highest percentage of African-American PhDs come from Southern universities. There's a huge number of American writers who come out of the South. So the culture and the background of the South, and that's, we have to mention blues and jazz and all sorts of other things. So the South is a culturally rich and an area where there's been lots of important popular movements, including during this period of the 1930s and 1940s that I write about. So the possibilities for reinvigorating and transforming the South are there, with many positive features existing. And let me just and in terms of cultural things, one interesting thing. So Memphis during the 30s and 40s became a highly unionized city. And by the 40s, some of the big unions were interracial unions. And this meant that, as opposed to, and Memphis, Tennessee, for people who don't know, is right on top of the Mississippi Delta, borders Mississippi, and was a center for, even some of the big plantation owners had their city houses in Memphis. So when Memphis workers organized, blacks and whites who had been previously been totally segregated had much more social interaction, meaning that whites went to bars and juke joints in the Black community. This is what happened to Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley got a certain amount of his music from hanging out in the Black music places and bars in Memphis, which were open to having whites as a basis, because they had been partially integrated by interracial unions. And the mixing of culture that took place, and the birth perhaps of rock and roll comes in part as a result of this success of interracial unions in the South.
So Ben, I just wanted to add one other thing to this whole discussion about how the failure to unionize shows itself now. And I believe that what we're seeing is, I mean, in places where there's a history of unionization, we have this kind of buildup of resources and support for movements, for growth beyond the workplace. And political growth, economic growth, and deeper understandings of how change happens, I think, and a greater level of know-how in terms of organizing and forms of organization. And I say, in the absence of that, what you have are societies that are not as strong in terms of being able to see these kind of strides forward. So I think that this kind of, there's a straight line between the lack of unionization and what we're seeing in some cities. And I really have I learned that a lot from workers, actually, when people were talking to me about Charleston, for an example. And so I think that's another aspect of this phenomenon.
Charleston, South Carolina, we're talking about, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So before the country shut down, I gave a talk in Charleston in early March. Interesting place with an interesting history. So one thing I want to add, and this is some sense a theoretical point, but for when unions are strong and people believe, and they're interracial unions and people believe in their collective strength, they're less open to being misled or being fed a bunch of myths about how things work. When people who are working class or poor do not have collective organization, they're often prone to all sorts of funny things, whether it be birtherism or anti-gay attitudes or all sorts of things like that. And this mostly affects whites, but it takes place among African Americans too. I mean, there was a period, and even the lack of belief in science, often people are more susceptible to when they don't have collective organization. So we see these preachers saying that you don't have to worry about going to church, that God will save you from the coronavirus, right? This sort of stuff, and people believe that, right? Whereas we look, even with the problems that labor unions have now, some of them are standing up for people's rights not to get infected. And the deunionization of the meatpacking industry has left the workers there much more vulnerable. Whereas the places where there are unions, they're insisting that places only reopen in a safe way during the pandemic. And they don't buy any of this anti-science, anti-medical stuff. So the auto workers have been negotiating with where the plants are unionized with auto companies in order to, based on the best medical assessments, how to work in the plants without people infecting each other. And if you don't have a union, you might be susceptible to all sorts of funny ideas about what's possible. And employers are not above pushing these sort of things in order to get production out, if they can get away with it.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for that. And I think this has been a really, really rich discussion, and we've got a number of questions in the chat box. So let me go to the first one. So some have started to argue that healthcare, education, and logistics have particular structural leverage today. What areas do you think have particularly strong potential leverage in the South, or in particular subregions of the South? And I think that's for both of y'all.
Yeah, so public sector workers are interesting. And I think one of the things historically, both about school teachers and postal workers, is that everybody knows school teachers and everybody knows some postal workers, right? And so these people have a lot of community sympathy. So we've seen not just as a red state phenomenon, but in many of the Republican states where they've cut their budgets and their taxes to such a degree, school teachers are dramatically underpaid, and classes are even bigger than in other states. But this isn't just true. I mean, the Chicago teachers strike, strikes in the past decade are suggestive that this takes place not just in the South or not just in Republican states, but in democratically controlled states too. So school teachers, if they do things right, are able, both have leverage, but they're also able to develop a lot of what I call associative power. Hospital workers, and I would add, not hospital workers, grocery workers, warehouse workers. In the current period, the pandemic points out just how crucial these are to the life and death of the rest of us. These people not only have sympathy, but they have leverage. And this is part of the labor movement of the future. So statistics. So I actually have a background when mostly I deal with data before I did more of the archival work. So there are approximately 21 million healthcare workers in the country. While a big thing is made of doctors and nurses, the overwhelming majority, I mean, doctors are paid well, and most nurses are paid well, depending on the part of the country. But in most parts of the country, they're unionized, they're paid well, they tend to be overworked. But the overwhelming majority of healthcare workers are underpaid workers who work in transport, who work in dietary things, and it's just a huge range of things that makes the healthcare system go. And our healthcare system, as we all know, is more dysfunctional than that in any other developed country, and more dysfunctional than some in underdeveloped countries. So the organization of the whole healthcare industry, the logistic industry, and whatnot, would provide a huge impetus and quite a bit of leverage for workers in the current period. And so the interesting thing, and you can see, so in Amazon, when workers protest or try to organize, they were fired. But an indication of the type of sympathy, a vice president from Amazon resigned the other day because of the way he said that top management had responded to the health concerns of workers. Interesting. I can't imagine that have happened in any prior type of period. And so I think that workers in these industries will have broader sympathy and support, and also the current conditions make them more willing and likely to organize than was previously, because in fact, many of them are in life and death types of situations in terms of exposure to disease. So I'm not in the business of predicting what's going to happen. There was a time when I would make these predictions and they all turned out to be wrong. So I have a little bit of hesitancy on this sort of thing. But I think the possibilities for organizing, particularly in those industries that I would say not like coal, but are not movable. Healthcare isn't movable. School teachers aren't movable. Trucking and transportation and warehouse work aren't movable. Construction is not movable. I mean, little pieces of it are, but these are not like textile or electronics that can be moved abroad and have the product shipped back. They're, as one well-known person said, these are landlocked industries. They're not ones that can be global. So, and let me just say that the upsurges that take place among working class people are usually unpredictable. So I wrote an earlier book on the decline of organized labor in the United States. And at the end, one thing I quote, a lot of the top labor economists and economists said that the labor movement has disappeared. It will no longer be back. And this was in the end of 1932 and 1933, beginning of 1933, a period when from 1933 to 1945, unionized workers went from less than 3 million to 15 million. And we had some of the massive labor struggles as anyone has seen around the world. So the possibilities are there. One keeps on plugging and we'll see what happens. But this is certainly, I mean, it's a scary period for all of us to be sure, but it's interesting if you step back, or if you can step back, it's an interesting period to see the social movements that have taken place. And these range from Black Lives Matter to healthcare to a variety of other things. And it may be that there's enough synergy to help get a revitalized labor movement off the ground in the not too distant future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, Roz, you're a former hospital worker. Do you have any thoughts on this kind of question of essential workers right now?
I am a former hospital worker and organizer. And so I lost connection for a little bit there. So I don't know whether this really adds anything or not. But I wanted to talk about that in the context of this whole structural and associative power, where that question about education or the other three things, and that leads to the, and so I think that and of those three, the structural power is more with the teachers because of the things that with the education system, primarily the teachers, that where it connects to the points that Michael raised earlier. But I question at this time, as we look at this virus, whether this, whether this is, the structure is fluid, this whole question of fluidity of structure. So what we have are these workers who were not paid attention to, who were definitely in the category of when they're organizing, really requiring a whole community to help them win power and to win a union, suddenly are in another space and seen as having their power look a little bit different because of the current objective situation. So it makes me wonder and think if some folks who are doing research might think about historically and the possibilities of this shift, this fluidity around workers' structural place, because this time surely brings that up for me. but I think that what is true is that there are these workers who are now who are considered essential, that there is an opportunity to do organizing. And I think it's really it's really up to folks, up to them and folks who can help them organize to really get that, to do that in this moment. I don't know much about this, but I've heard about there's this organizing that's happening where they're really talking to these workers and organizing these workers telephonically who are in these situations, who are workers who might not have much power, but now in this position have more power. And I know that and some of these that exist, but this whole question of the fluidity of a relationship to structure is an interesting one.
Absolutely. So there's a number of questions in the chat box. We only have about 30 minutes, so I want to try to combine some of the questions. I hope that's okay. Some of the questions kind of touch on the same issues. So one questioner asks, please talk about the conscious element, the question of cadre. What examples from your study and experience helps you understand the role of leadership in organizing in the South? And another questioner kind of asked, what about DSA, which I think was a question that was asked when we were talking about the Communist Party. So this question of kind of cadre, leadership, and then I think a kind of current day manifestation of a socialist organization is DSA. I have thoughts on some of these things.
Yeah. So the Communist Party had a clear line on organizing the South. They had a position which I don't want to go into, that, but which is certainly debated and controversial, that there was a separate Black nation in the South who had the right to secede, and they thought that they could unleash the revolutionary potential of the South. The Communist Party was a disciplined organization that had a clear line on various things. So I don't think you can really compare them to DSA, which is a very amorphous organization. And I'm not an expert on DSA, but when I talk to people, there are people with very different views on all sorts of things. But certainly, and in some sense, DSA is more like some of the groups in the 60s where there were, broad organization with where people didn't have the same view on things. But I think the key thing that you look at in almost all these periods of organizing the world over, it's young people who are energized and inspired, who have broad commitment to social change, who do the organizing. So sometimes we see that the initial upsurges take place with student mobilizations. So in South Korea, where it was certainly the union organizing and the workers' movement, which played the major role in overthrowing the dictatorship, students were the first people out to demonstrate, and students and workers eventually won the support of the population of the country as a whole. So it's going to take big commitment, lots of people, but as they say, a single spark is what starts a forest fire. So sometimes a small group of people doing some very successful and dramatic organizing can be the spark that inspires all sorts of other people. But clearly, a developing and growing and committed left is critical in almost every place to the flowering of these social movements and labor struggles. I don't know if that fully deals with the question, but that's certainly part of it.
Roz?
I'll go after you, Ben. You were looking like you had a whole lot to add there. You want to?
Well, okay.
I know you're the questioner, but I didn't.
I know you're messing me all up, Roz. It's all good. Well, I actually had a quick
Yeah.
point. I think it's interesting that, the DSA thing. I think it's a really encouraging development. It's actually an interesting kind of thing to look at the experience of the Communist Party. And I think there was a few, although I think Mike really deftly talks about the kind of contradictory nature of the Communist Party. I think they did a few things really interestingly that I think we could really learn from today. I mean, number one was that they had this incredibly strong focus on the South. They spent a tremendous amount of energy thinking about the South, spent resources, spent time, sent organizers, really dug into the South and took it very serious. I mean, there was these incredible struggles that Mike talked about, Scottsboro, Angelo Herndon, there's a list of things you could talk about. I think they had a really strong emphasis on internationalism. They considered themselves to be a part of an international movement. They focused on the most downtrodden workers and the most oppressed sections of the working class, which I think was a really important piece of their work. And then they really focused, like Mike said, on the development of cadre and being a disciplined organization. So I think those, four things are kind of lessons we could learn today as folks are kind of figuring out new formations. And Roz, I would love to hear your thoughts.
I think you covered that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I got it. Cool. So there's another question. I was wondering how you describe the relationship, if any, between the organizing in the 30s and 40s and the successful organizing in the late 60s in the South, specifically the Memphis sanitation workers and the Charleston hospital workers in 1968, which I think, Roz is a strategic advisor for the Poor People's Campaign. I've done a lot of work on that, and I know a lot of folks at the People's Forum have done work on that. And those were two kind of labor organizing drives that were deeply connected to the Poor People's Campaign. So that kind of connection between the 30s and 40s organizing and this kind of late 60s upsurge in the South. Roz, I actually think, Roz, since you didn't go on the last one, it'd be great to hear from you on this piece, and then Mike. Yeah.
So, so is the question is about the period in the 30s and the 60s where there was successful organizing, and how are they related?
How are they related, or are they related? Is there any connection?
Yeah. So to me, it seems like there is a clear connection. I mean, there's one of the connections that really strike me is that in both instances there were either budding or in place movements, support from communities, kind of this leadership that was clear and that had been developed in those instances. I believe I think those are similarities. In both cases, the workers, in both cases, at different points in those struggles, the workers were further ahead than their unions based on their understanding of their own circumstance, their connections to movements, however small, that they were engaged in. And so in some of those instances, at some time in the trajectory of those struggles, you saw where the workers were out ahead because of their leadership, because of their connection to communities, and because of their willingness to strike, and that they'd come to a point where they were ready to move and required their community and their union to move ahead.
Yeah, so I think that's right. So one of the things that happened in both Memphis and Charleston is there was a merging of the civil rights movement and the labor movement. And Memphis is particularly interesting because the African-American community, including the the business community and the business leaders in the African American community were completely excluded from the political leadership of Memphis. So they supported the sanitation workers as part of a civil rights struggle. Interestingly, the Black elite was incorporated into the Memphis power structure in the years succeeding. And when Black hospital workers struck, they opposed them. And we saw the same thing happen in Atlanta under Mayor Ferguson, who was something of a liberal Democrat, who crushed the sanitation workers' strike in Atlanta. Charleston was a similar merging of civil rights. And while there were, I would argue that most unions, including liberal ones like the auto workers, did very little to support the civil rights movement except provide window dressing when Walter Reuther marched with Martin Luther King, or they gave money. There were a couple unions that actually gave more support. One was the Hospital Workers 1199 union based in New York. AFSCME, in certain cases, gave supports. And the third union that gave a lot of support was a left-wing union, the Packing House Workers, which was centered in Chicago. But aside from that, the major unions didn't give any support to civil rights. So in those two examples, labor and civil rights merged, and the labor demands and civil rights demands were part of the same. So in Memphis, you had signs that said, "I am a man," right? So the sanitation workers say, "You recognize me as a human being. I have equal rights," even though Memphis is almost as deep south as you can get, short of being in rural Mississippi. So those demands were merged, and they engendered lots of community support because of that merger. So this is an example of how associative power was merged with the structural power to provide powerful movements in both of those two places, Charleston and Memphis. So that's my analogy. And so I think that's what gives it continuity from the struggles in the 1930s and the 1940s, where there were far more examples of that merging of the labor civil rights movement, including in Winston-Salem, where Roz is from, but in numerous other locales. So this is instructive of how you should be, or one should be organizing.
Absolutely.
I was just going to comment on the Winston-Salem struggle at R.J. Reynolds. I mean, it's a real clear example where those movements came together, but then they not only, and they came together because there was a terrific amount of oppression in the both at work and in the Black community. But one thing that came out of that organizing in Winston-Salem, and sounds like in other places, is that the Black community, there was a leap, a lot of some wins, some victories for the Black community as a whole, as well as the workers, at least for, in many cases, even though it was a limited time. So out of the Winston-Salem struggle, for example, we had first Black politicians and, a strong kind of outcome in terms of shifts in both economic power and political power for African Americans, and that resulted from that struggle that taught in many ways, because of their own organization inside the plants, they were able to take that and add that to the civil rights movement and help to even make it stronger. So there's so many lessons to be in struggles back.
Great, thank you. So there's a couple questions. I'm going to read the first and then kind of relate another one to it. So one person asked, do you see the emergence of a different sort of worker movement / organization that will meet the challenges of organizing in the current age of electronics? Do you think their forms of organizing will have to be different than how workers organized in the past? And then another person asks, that, you know, industry and manufacturing have changed and become more mechanized. Younger workers have been referred to as the precariat. Is this true in the South to the same degree, and how does it impact organizing? So I think it's kind of questions about the structure of the economy and how that impacts organizing in the current period.
So the structure of the economy is a complicated question. We clearly don't have as many industrial workers as we used to have. The majority of traditional proletarians, or what Marx described as proletarians and industrial workers, several hundred million of them are in China. We have a much smaller percentage than we used to have, although there are other industries that have become more critical to the economy, but we're still overwhelmingly a service economy more than we used to be. So, and some of these workers, as we've indicated, have more leverage than others, but other workers can be swept up in mass movements and allies with other people. Automation affects things fairly dramatically. So we see that in the auto industry, where there is still the number of workers hasn't declined that much in North America, but they're producing 4, 5, 6 times as many automobiles as they used to with the same amount of workers. One of the few industries that was expanding was the airline industry, although I think that we can't make any predictions about that at this point. And technology, obviously people use whatever technology is available, but this idea that social media is responsible for the development of certain types of movements, I find not always persuasive. So for example, there's been a lot written about the Arab Spring in Egypt and all the young people with social media. But the biggest impetus and turning point for regime change, or the initial regime change and elections in Egypt, came from workers, and particularly textile workers. And they didn't use social media. They used traditional forms of underground organizing. But the media mostly paid attention to all the young people calling demonstrations with their smartphones and that sort of thing. So I think that organizing take a variety of forms, and to the degree that organizers can use social media to do that, you do it. But in a lot of ways, once risk of infection gets diminished, it's talking to people one-on-one and having in workplace groups of people doing the organizing that is the key to success, as it's always been. So I don't think that I think the technology is important. We're using technology now to have a discussion and whatnot, but that it's exaggerated to the degree that that's replaced traditional types of organizing.
Yeah,
that's my opinion. I don't have, there's no research on this exactly.
So I think I'm in agreement with what you've said, Michael, and I wanted to go back a little bit to this whole question of different forms. That I agree that that social media is not the answer, that it helps, and that we have to, that a lot of the ways we've organized historically, you know, really one-on-one talking to workers. And I believe, and that I think that's important. And I believe that we may be in a period, based on the kinds of work people do, where we might have to, I think the unions have to start thinking about different forms of organizing based on the different jobs and the different opportunities to bring people together in industry or in jobs that are spread out and there's no one employer. I mean, I think a good example is the work that's in North Carolina, right now. I don't know if you want to say a word about it, Ben, but the work that's happening there, I think is a real good example of the kind of organization that workers might have to build because of of how they're dispersed, and but they have common interests and the ability to see their common both enemy and their common interest. And so I think that those kinds of organizations may be on the horizon, but I think that the unions really need to be thinking ahead about how people are organized, how people get health care. There needs to be a lot of forward thinking, and I'm sure that's happening.
All right, Roz, you provoked me, but I'll spend a quick second talking about some of the work in North Carolina. I think it's a really important question right now. And I think it actually relates directly to the question of structural and associative power. And so, the organization that's trying to be built that really has emerged out of the Fight for 15 movement in North Carolina is geographically based and really unites together workers across what are typically called low-wage jobs, these service sector, warehouses, hospitals, fast food restaurants, grocery store, essential jobs, as they call them now. And so, a lot of the struggle that we're working on waging is really how do you organize and build an organization that corresponds to the lives that workers live right now, which is that people filter from one job to another. A lot of our members have 10 jobs in a year. And then now what people are facing is a massive crisis of unemployment on the one hand, and this kind of new category of essential workers on the other, being told that they're essential to the economy, but kind of still being thrown into, tremendous danger. And so what we're trying to build is something that's uniting workers across industries in a geography. And I think it's a very particular way of kind of exercising associative power of workers through an organization. And I think we could have a long conversation about that, but we're getting close to 8 o'clock. So I wanted to try to, but thank you for bringing that up, Roz. So I wanted to just kind of tackle a couple of the last questions in the box. So Roz, I think this one is really for you, although I think it'd be interesting to hear Mike's thoughts too. There's a question about 95, 98 in North Carolina, the law, kind of outlawing public sector collective bargaining. And just, if North Carolina public workers were organized, it would change the political and labor landscape. And Roz, I know that you, as much as anybody, have done tremendous work, trying to win the right for public sector workers to unionize in North Carolina. So I'd love to hear you talk about that. And then I'm sure, Mike, you've got thoughts on Southern public sector organizing.
So, it's no, and so it's no accident that there is always pushback against public sector worker organizing. It's a huge group of folks who could wield a huge amount of power. And it's the leaders in North Carolina believe that it's their job to hold that power down and to not let it come to fruition. And so the keep holding back this organization really is an attempt to squelch and to keep to keep these workers down, and to also serve it as an example to say, we're not letting them organize, and don't you try to organize. I mean, it's really a whole, it sets an example and holds these workers back. The consequence is that the political power of a whole sector of people is dampened, and people aren't able to have and exercise the kind of power, or make sure that the kinds of labor laws and support for labor is not there. The other side of that is that there still remains, with that even in place, a number of workers who are still fighting, who without collective bargaining still manage to build build organizations, still manage to fight back. and still manage to take as much power and control as they're able. But what we see is that those particular laws really have had the impact of really holding people down and dividing in a way the working class and keeping people from being able to move forward. Michael, you may have more to.
Yeah, so I've studied and written about public sector unions, as well as having some public sector jobs in my distant past. So the interesting thing is, let's talk first about the school teachers. So the upsurge in before 1960, there were only a tiny percentage of public sector workers across the country were organized, mostly in the federal government, but less than 5% unionization. The American Federation of Teachers had two limping chapters. One was in New York, the other was in Chicago, and they didn't have many members. In 1948, teachers in Buffalo, New York had struck a militant strike. They were crushed. And the New York State passed some of the most draconian anti-public sector labor organizing laws. It was called the Conlon-Wadlin Act, and people were subject to 5 years in jail, loss of jobs and pay, and all that sort of stuff. The jail terms were for leaders. So there wasn't much striking. But in late 1960, between 1960 and 1961, 50,000 New York City school teachers struck. And there was no question that you were going to put 50,000 people in jail and fine them huge amounts of money. They had broad sympathy. And on the basis of the New York City teachers strike, the American Federation of Teachers, within months, had dozens of chapters where all the teachers were organized throughout big cities across the country. West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, and whatnot. And that was really the impetus for public sector unions taking off. And today we still have 35 to 40% public sector workers organized across the country, including most federal employees, large percentage of local municipal workers are organized across the country. So the moral of this is that while the laws can inhibit people, once these upsurges take place, the laws go out the window. And you can't tell what type of upsurge is going to lead to stimulus and broaden the imagination of workers across the country. So in 1948, the Buffalo teachers strike didn't influence anybody positively, whereas the 1960 New York City teachers strike encouraged public sector union organizing across the country, first with teachers and then with almost every other public sector occupation. So these labor upsurges take place in huge waves. The spark that sets them off is often unpredictable. And I think that, we've seen this with public sector organizing in West Virginia, where it's illegal. In all these Republican states that have laws just like North Carolina's, teachers mobilize fully. They get a lot of public support, and the government is hesitant or afraid to do anything to these people. We've seen that in probably a dozen states so far, right? Kansas, which has had right-wing Republicans running the state, who's cut the budget and school teachers' pay dramatically. So while these laws hold people back for a while, they don't tend to hold people back forever. And so I'm hopeful that North Carolina, at some point, people will rise up laws be damned and successfully organize.
Well, that is a great way to end us. And I think that is what's happening in North Carolina and all over the South. So it's 8 o'clock. This has been a really, really great discussion. Mike and Roz, I think the meeting of y'all's minds has been really, really interesting. And I hope after Roz finishes her autobiography, y'all do write a book. That'd be great. So The Southern Key, Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 40s. Mike's holding it up. It's an incredible book, really. I mean, I can tell you, really, there's organizers and movement leaders all over the country and in the South reading this book and really, I think, deeply considering the questions. So I just really want to thank you, Mike. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Let me just mention, also on my Facebook page, there's a publicly accessible discount coupon. So you can get 30% off from Oxford University Press, which is much cheaper than the Amazon price.
All right. So everybody friend Mike on Facebook.
Well, you don't have to friend me. It's publicly available. And the warehouse, I understand, in your neighborhood in Cary, North Carolina, is now open.
Oh, good. Okay. So it's shipping again.
So it's shipping again. Right.
Folks, go out and get the book. I hope we can do this again. Roz, thank you so much.
Welcome. My pleasure. It's great.
Yeah. Oh, I thank both of you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things. After being a secluded researcher all to myself for so long.
It's important work, and it's really made a difference. So thanks y'all so much. And thanks to the People's Forum and to everybody who tuned in. I hope everybody's staying safe out there, and solidarity from the South.
Great. Thank you.